You were taught that Rome fell in 476 AD. Barbarians at the gates, the greatest empire the world had ever seen, gone just like that. One catastrophic moment, one final blow. That's the version most of us grew up with, and I understand why it's stuck. It's clean, it's dramatic, it feels like history is supposed to feel. But it's wrong. Not a little wrong. Fundamentally wrong. Because Rome didn't fall the way a building falls. It dissolved, quietly over centuries, the way something rots from the inside long before anyone notices. And the strangest part is that the people living through it mostly didn't know. They woke up, went to the market, raised their children, and the whole time the world they assumed was permanent was quietly falling apart beneath their feet. That's the story I want to tell you. Not the collapse as an event, the collapse as a process. And once you hear it this way, I don't think you'll be able to stop asking what it means for the rest of us. Let's start with the version that got into our heads. At its height, Rome was something genuinely hard to imagine from where we're sitting. It stretched from the cold gray coasts of Britain all the way to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the edge of the Sahara. Millions of people, speaking different languages, worshiping different gods, born into wildly different worlds, all held inside a single system. Roman law, Roman roads, Roman currency. For hundreds of years, this thing just worked. And then it didn't. The story goes like this. Barbarians, Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, names that carry their own weight, names that sound like impact. In 410 AD, Alaric leads his Visigoths into Rome itself, the first time a foreign army has walked those streets in 800 years. People at the time genuinely couldn't believe it. Some thought it was the end of the world. Then, in 455, the Vandals come, and in 476 AD, a general named Odoacer deposes the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager, which tells you everything, and the Western Empire ceases to exist. The end. Cue the Dark Ages. It's a compelling story, and there's truth in it, but here's what it leaves out. The previous 200 years, the pandemics, the economic unraveling, the currency that stopped meaning anything, the civil wars that came and went so regularly they almost felt normal, the borders already giving way long before any barbarian army organized itself into a threat. By the time Odoacer walked into Ravenna and quietly told Romulus to pack his things, the Western Empire wasn't a lion being brought down in its prime. It was a patient who had been critical for generations. The barbarians didn't kill Rome. They were just there when it finally stopped breathing. The real story starts much earlier, not with an invading army, with 6 soldiers coming home from a war.
The year is 165 AD, and things look good. Marcus Aurelius is on the throne, the philosopher-emperor, the one who wrote Meditations while managing an empire. The Pax Romana had held for nearly a century. The system was functioning. People had reason to feel secure. Then the legions came home from a campaign in the east, and they brought something with them that no one could see. We don't know exactly what it was. Modern historians lean toward smallpox, possibly measles. What we do know is what it did. It moved through the empire with terrible efficiency, city to city, legion to legion, farm to farm. The Antonine Plague lasted roughly 15 years. At its height, ancient sources describe up to 2,000 deaths a day in Rome alone. Across the empire, somewhere between 5 and 10 million dead. In some regions, a third of the population simply gone. A third of the people. Imagine watching that happen, not as a statistic, but as the farmer next to you, the soldier in your unit, the trader you bought grain from every season. Gone. And the season after that, nobody to plant the fields. Harvests failed. Trade routes went quiet. The legions couldn't fill their ranks. Tax revenue collapsed because the taxpayers were dead. Marcus Aurelius spent the rest of his reign trying to hold it together against threats that smelled the weakness. He managed it, but only just. When he died in 180 AD, he left the throne to his son. His son was Commodus. Where Marcus was deliberate, disciplined, genuinely devoted to the idea that power was a responsibility, Commodus was a disaster, erratic, cruel in the impulsive way of someone who has never once been told no. He preferred the arena to governance. He renamed Rome after himself. He had people killed for minor slights. And while he played at being Hercules, the empire's beeper problems compounded quietly in the background. In 192 AD, he was strangled in his bath, and what followed was worse. In the single year of 193 AD, Rome went through 5 emperors, 5 men who seized power, held it briefly, and died for it. But the real damage wasn't any one of those deaths. It was the lesson the army took from all of them, that they could decide who sat on the throne. Once an army learns that, you can't unteach it. What followed is called the crisis of the 3rd century. From 235 to 284 AD, nearly 50 years, Rome churned through roughly 50 emperors. Most died violently. The empire fractured. Borders that had been secure for generations began to give. And then the plague came back. The plague of Cyprian struck in 249 AD and didn't leave for 20 years. Ancient sources describe 5,000 deaths a day in Rome at its peak. Even at a fraction of that, the empire that had barely survived the first pandemic was being hit again before it had ever fully healed. By the end of the 3rd century, Rome had survived, but it was carrying wounds that would never fully close. The question was no longer whether the system could absorb another shock. The answer was, quite a few more were coming.
Here's what most accounts get wrong about how empires fall. It's not that the enemies get stronger, it's that the system stops working. The wall breaks not because it was never strong enough, but because nobody was left to repair it, fund it, or believe it was worth defending. That's what happened to Rome in the 3rd and 4th centuries, and it started, the way these things often do, with the money. Rome's economy ran on trust, and that trust was breaking. The denarius, Rome's silver coin, had been the backbone of commerce for centuries. Merchants across 3 continents priced in it. Legions accepted it as pay. It meant something. Then the emperors ran out of money. Wars were expensive, the army was expensive, and the army, which had just shown it could make and unmake rulers, needed to stay happy. So they did what desperate governments do. They diluted the currency. Less silver per coin, a little bronze, then more bronze, then mostly bronze. Under Nero, the denarius was roughly 90% silver. By the mid-3rd century, 5%. The coin still had the emperor's face on it, but it was worthless. Imagine watching prices double in your lifetime, then double again. Your wages haven't changed, the coin in your hand looks the same as it always did, but you can feel, in the market every week, that it buys less, and less, and less. That's not an abstract economic concept. That's a kind of slow, grinding dread. Merchants raised prices to compensate. Soldiers demanded more pay. The wealthy stopped holding coins and started hoarding land, grain, gold, anything real. What Rome experienced was something modern economists would call hyperinflation. The trade networks that had connected the empire began to seize. Tax revenue collapsed. And with less money coming in, the response was more debasement. The spiral fed itself. Then there was the corruption, which was really just the same problem wearing a different face. Running an empire the size of Rome requires thousands of administrators, governors, tax collectors, judges, customs officials. And when the center is weak, when emperors change every 2 years, when loyalty is for sale and your position could vanish overnight, those administrators don't serve the empire.
They served themselves. Tax collectors skimmed, governors extracted, military commanders redirected resources toward their own ambitions. The apparatus built to hold everything together became the primary tool for hollowing it out. The people who felt it sharpest were the ones at the bottom. Small farmers who couldn't fight the assessments, craftsmen whose workshops the inflation destroyed, ordinary people who had assumed, quietly and for their whole lives, that the Roman system would protect them, and who were now discovering it wouldn't. When the state fails to protect you, you find someone who will. Across the empire, ordinary people started binding themselves to large landowners, aristocrats who could offer what Rome no longer could: security, food, a degree of predictability. In exchange, they gave up their freedom to leave, their independence, their future. Imagine your farm still standing, still producing, still yours in name, but you can't leave. You work for the man who protects you, because the alternative is to be unprotected in a world that's becoming dangerous. That arrangement had a name in Roman law, the colonate, and it was spreading everywhere. Medieval feudalism didn't come from the Middle Ages. It was built inside the late Roman Empire, from the bottom up, by millions of desperate people making the only reasonable choice available to them. The darkness didn't come from outside. Rome built it from within. One transaction at a time.
There's a part of this story that almost never makes it into the classroom version. And for me, it's the part that makes the whole thing feel genuinely tragic rather than just inevitable. Rome's collapse wasn't just a Roman failure. It was happening inside a much larger disruption, climatic, environmental, demographic, that was reshaping the entire Eurasian world at once, and nobody living through it had any way to see the full picture. For roughly 5 centuries, the Mediterranean had enjoyed unusually stable, warm conditions. Climatologists call it the Roman climate optimum. Good harvests, reliable seasons, the kind of agricultural stability that lets populations grow and complex systems take root. Rome didn't just exist despite its environment, it was built on it. Then the climate shifted. Temperatures dropped. Growing seasons shortened. A series of massive volcanic eruptions in the 530s and 540s filled the upper atmosphere with debris and partially blocked the sun. Across the northern hemisphere, temperatures plummeted, crops failed, famines followed. The late antique Little Ice Age, as researchers now call it, made life in parts of Europe and the Near East nearly impossible to sustain. And into that already destabilized world came the plague of Justinian in 541 AD. Bubonic plague, the same bacterium that would return as the Black Death 8 centuries later. Some estimates put the death toll at 1/4 to half of the population in affected regions. Entire cities emptied. But here's what changes the whole picture. These pressures weren't only falling on Rome, they were falling on everyone, including the people on Rome's borders. The groups Rome called barbarians weren't a coordinated force with a plan. Most of them weren't invaders in any meaningful sense. They were peoples under pressure, running from something, looking for somewhere safer to be. The Huns pushed west from the eastern steppes, likely driven by climate pressure on the grasslands that sustained them. And as they moved, they pushed everyone in their path further west, a chain reaction that ended at Rome's doorstep. The Visigoths didn't arrive at the Danube as conquerors. They arrived in crisis, asking, formally, respectfully, to be allowed to cross into Roman territory. They offered to serve in the legions. They wanted to become Roman. Valens said yes. What followed was one of the most catastrophic acts of administrative failure in Roman history. The officials handling the resettlement were corrupt. The Goths were promised food and received exploitation. Their weapons were supposed to be collected. Officials took bribes and let them keep them. In some accounts, Gothic children were sold into slavery.
A people who crossed the border asking for safety were treated as an opportunity for profit. So they did what anyone would do. They revolted. In 378 AD, at Adrianople, the Visigoths destroyed one of the finest Roman armies of the era and killed the Emperor Valens. It wasn't a military miracle, it was the direct consequence of institutional rot, a system that had become so corrupt, so indifferent to its own values, that it transformed desperate refugees into existential enemies. After Adrianople, the frontier logic changed permanently. The armies defending Rome in the 5th century were increasingly led by men who weren't Roman by birth, half-Vandals, former hostages, men who had grown up on both sides of the border. In better circumstances, that might have been Rome's greatest strength, but the center that was supposed to hold it all together had already stopped working. In the east, richer and better protected by geography, Constantinople endured. But the west was becoming something else. Not quite Rome, not yet what would come after. Something in between, without a name yet.
So, 476 AD. The date stamped in every textbook. The fall of Rome, the end of the ancient world. The emperor at the center of this moment is a teenager named Romulus Augustulus. His father, a general named Orestes, had chosen the name carefully. Romulus, the mythical founder, Augustus, the first emperor. A name built entirely out of borrowed greatness, designed to lend legitimacy to a boy who controlled almost nothing. What did he actually control? Italy, essentially just Italy. Gaul had long been divided among Germanic kingdoms, Spain the same. North Africa had been in Vandal hands for nearly 50 years, Britain abandoned decades earlier. The grand architecture of the Western Empire had already been replaced, piece by a patchwork of successor powers, most of whom thought of themselves not as destroyers of Rome, but as its inheritors. They used Roman law, spoke Latin, minted coins with Roman imagery. When Odoacer, himself of barbarian origin, himself a product of the mixed frontier world Rome had built, walked into Ravenna and told Romulus to step down, he didn't declare independence. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and asked to be recognized as Rome's representative in Italy. He still wanted to be Roman, he just wanted to be the one in charge. Nobody in the room thought they were watching the end of the world, because by that point it had already been ending for so long that this felt like one more change in a long string of changes. The office of Western Emperor wasn't stormed or conquered, it just stopped being filled, like a chair that nobody bothered to take anymore. The next morning, the sun came up, markets opened, children went to school, schools still teaching Virgil, still reading Cicero, still using Latin. The church continued its work. The Colosseum still stood. The Forum was still there. A person walking through Rome in 480 AD would have found a city that looked on the surface like Rome. But the thing that had made it Rome, the system, the administration, the capacity to enforce law and project power across a continent, was gone. Not dramatically, just incrementally, irreversibly absent. Not with a bang, with a long, quiet silence where the machinery used to be. Now, here's the part that genuinely surprises most people. Rome didn't fall in 476 AD. Half of it did. While the Western Empire splintered into successor kingdoms, the Eastern Roman Empire kept going, still governed from Constantinople, still enforcing Roman law, still calling itself Roman, because it was. Not a fading remnant clinging to a dead identity, a thriving civilization of many millions of people, and they would remain one for nearly 1,000 years after the date we call Rome's fall. Under Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565 AD, the East went on the offensive.
His general Belisarius reconquered North Africa from the Vandals in little more than a year, then spent 2 grinding decades reconquering Italy from the Ostrogoths. Justinian also produced the Corpus Juris Civilis, the most comprehensive codification of Roman law ever assembled, still fingerprinted across legal systems around the world today. The Eastern Empire, which historians call Byzantine, though the Byzantines simply called it Rome, survived the rise of Islam, the Arab conquests, the Crusades, the Seljuk Turks, 9 centuries of continuous pressure from nearly every direction. It preserved ancient texts that otherwise would have been lost. It kept something alive that the West had let go. It finally ended on a Tuesday in late May 1453 AD, when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II breached the walls of Constantinople with artillery the ancient world couldn't have imagined. The last emperor, Constantine XI, is said to have torn off his imperial regalia and charged into the Ottoman forces on foot. They never found his body. That was the end of Rome. Not 476, not a boy emperor in Ravenna, 1453. A man dying on his feet, nearly 1,500 years after Augustus first called himself emperor. When you hold that whole span together, when you really feel the length of it, the story changes completely. Rome's fall wasn't a moment, it was a process that took longer than the entire interval between us and the Black Death. The idea of a clean before and after, a day the lights went out, that was always a story we told ourselves afterward, because we needed the past to have neat edges that the present never does. Rome didn't fall in a day. It came apart slowly, over centuries, in ways that were almost impossible to see from inside. Each crisis survivable on its own, each compromise the logical response to a situation nobody had chosen. The plague arrived, and people buried their dead and kept going. The coins lost their value, and merchants adjusted their prices and kept going. The emperors came and went, and the people beneath them developed a practiced fatalism about power and kept going. The farmers lost their land and their freedom, and they made whatever arrangements kept them alive and kept going. That's what people do. We adapt, we normalize, we look at things that would have been unthinkable to our grandparents and think, this is just how it is now, and we keep going. The senators who kept showing up to a Senate that hadn't made a real decision in generations, they weren't stupid. They were doing what people do in institutions that have lost their purpose, performing the familiar rituals, because the familiar is less frightening than staring into what comes next. The people inside Rome's collapse weren't watching Rome collapse. They were watching their grain prices, their local security, their children's futures. The civilizational scale of what was happening was invisible to them, the way the largest things always are when you're standing inside them. And that's the thought I can't shake. Not the barbarians, not the battles, not the date, the invisibility. Because every generation assumes they'd recognize the collapse if it came, that it would be loud, obvious, impossible to miss. But Rome suggests something more unsettling. That the end of a world doesn't announce itself. It looks like rising prices that never quite come back down, institutions that still exist but don't quite function, leaders who keep changing, each one feeling like a temporary problem, never a permanent shift, systems that used to work, slowly, then all at once, not working anymore, and people adjusting, always adjusting, telling themselves it's temporary. Rome didn't fall because people stopped trying. It fell while everyone was still trying, still working, still governing, still believing the thing they were part of would continue, because it always had, until it didn't. And by then, there was no moment anyone could point to and say, that was it, that was when it ended. Just a long stretch of time where something familiar slowly became something else, and nobody could quite agree on when the line had been crossed.
The secrets of our past are the only map we have for the future. Subscribe to Chronopedia to keep digging.